I am Julian. I am 34 years old. Exactly 2 years ago, I walked out of a downtown Chicago courthouse with my finalized divorce papers clutched tightly in my right hand. Within 24 hours of that exact moment, my own parents completely disowned me for trying to save our family business from being robbed blind. While I was standing on those freezing concrete steps, still breathing in the bitter air of a completely destroyed marriage, I called my father. I told him to immediately fire all the staff my former in-laws had placed in our family company. His response was something I will never forget for as long as I live. He told me I was being vindictive, petty, and deeply embarrassing our family name in front of the entire community. That very same evening, my ex-mother-in-law stood on my front porch screaming that I was a worthless failure, while my own parents listened on speakerphone and enthusiastically agreed with every single word she said. They cast me out into the cold just to protect their precious social image. But there was one massive thing they did not know. My job as a senior compliance attorney meant I knew exactly how to track every single dime they thought they had hidden away in the dark. And today, the very people who threw me away like garbage are desperately begging for my help to stay out of a massive federal lawsuit. Before I tell you exactly how this entire nightmare went down, hit that like button if you truly believe that the truth always comes to light and justice eventually serves those who deserve it. And please, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact day the real devastation began. The wind coming off Lake Michigan that afternoon was absolutely brutal. It was the kind of cold that cuts straight through a heavy wool overcoat and settles deep inside your bones. Honestly, it matched exactly how I felt inside my chest. My divorce had been a grinding, miserable, deeply expensive process that dragged on for nearly a year and a half. My ex-wife had fought me for absolutely everything with a level of viciousness I did not know she possessed. She aimed straight for my base salary, my hard-earned retirement accounts, the small real estate investments I had made years before we were even married, and she even tried to claim a fabricated form of legal custody over the financial assets and the inheritance my grandfather had left me. She wanted to drain me completely dry. I fought back, not out of greed, but because I knew her family's long, dark track record of financial manipulation. During the early, supposedly happier days of our marriage, I had made a fatal error in judgment. I had convinced my father, Gideon, to hire several of her relatives at his logistics company. It was a terrible, foundational mistake. I spent the last 6 months of my marriage quietly uncovering a deeply hidden, sophisticated pattern of missing warehouse inventory, heavily padded expense reports, and phantom corporate vendors all tying directly back to my in-laws. They were quietly and efficiently bleeding my father's mid-sized company dry. When I brought this undeniable proof up to my ex-wife in the privacy of our kitchen, she completely gaslit me. She looked me dead in the eye and told me I was paranoid and controlling. So, I packed my bags, hired the most ruthless lawyer I could find, and filed for divorce. When the judge finally slammed the heavy wooden gavel down and declared the marriage officially and legally over, my very first instinct was to protect my blood. I gripped my phone on the courthouse steps, my knuckles turning stark white against the cold black plastic, and dialed my father's private office number. I laid it out clearly, without a single ounce of hesitation. I told him the divorce was officially done, the papers were signed, and that he needed to terminate my ex-wife's brother and her cousin by the absolute end of the business day before they drained his operating accounts completely dry. My father did not ask for the evidence I had compiled. He did not ask how I was holding up after the hardest, most draining day of my adult life. He let out a long, heavy, exasperated sigh that rattled harshly through the phone speaker. He told me I was letting a personal custody dispute over furniture and pride cloud my professional corporate judgment. He said I was making the family look chaotic, unstable, and weak. He told me that real businessmen do not act out of emotional spite, and he absolutely refused to fire them. That evening, the heavy brass doorbell of my townhouse rang aggressively. It was not a polite ring. It was a furious, continuous pressing of the button. I opened the heavy wooden door, and there stood Brenda, my former mother-in-law. She completely bypassed the standard social pleasantries and started screaming at the top of her lungs the very second the door cracked open. She demanded I immediately call my father back and secure her son's upcoming corporate promotion within the logistics company. She threatened to spread vicious, career-ending rumors about me to every single family friend we shared, ensuring I would be entirely blacklisted from our elite social circles. She practically spit in my face as she promised she would completely ruin my reputation at the next community HOA meeting just for her own personal entertainment. What truly shocked me, however, was not her unhinged, aggressive behavior. It was the undeniable fact that she had her expensive smartphone tightly gripped in her left hand, the screen glowing brightly in the evening darkness with an active phone call. The caller ID was clearly visible. It was my father. I stood there, frozen solid on my own front porch, listening to Gideon apologize profusely to Brenda for my supposedly erratic behavior. My own father told this vile woman that I was mentally unstable from the exhausting divorce proceedings and that her family's jobs and salaries were entirely safe under his roof. He told her I would no longer have any say, any influence, or any power in the family business whatsoever. He cut me off, right there on the porch, treating me like a rogue employee rather than his own flesh and blood. Brenda smiled a venomous, highly satisfied smile. She looked at me like I was a pathetic insect she had just crushed under her expensive designer heel. I closed the door gently. I did not yell. I did not throw anything against the drywall. I simply walked into my dark, quiet kitchen, poured a tall glass of cold tap water, and finally accepted the harsh, unvarnished reality that I no longer had a family. I thought the worst of the betrayal was over. I thought the emotional pain had finally reached its absolute ceiling. I was so incredibly wrong. 8 long, grueling months passed in total, suffocating silence. There were no incoming phone calls for Thanksgiving dinners. There were no quick text messages to check in and see if I was surviving the winter holidays completely alone. I spent all of my time working, burying my mind and my energy deep into complex corporate audits, massive legal briefs, and endless compliance spreadsheets. I rebuilt my life in the absolute quiet. Then, on a random Tuesday, a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope arrived in my locked mailbox. It was a wedding invitation. My younger brother, Harrison, was getting married to a woman named Valeria. Harrison was the undeniable, fiercely protected golden child of the Ward family. He was 32 years old, lived entirely for social media validation, and treated his entire existence like an endless, exhausting networking event. While I spent my long days in windowless corporate conference rooms meticulously reading compliance audits and hunting for hidden liabilities, Harrison was busy leasing luxury sports cars. He could barely afford the monthly payments on and pitching vague startup business ideas that always required someone else's hard-earned money. Valeria was absolutely perfect for him. She ran a boutique real estate development firm, proudly drove a brand new, aggressively loud Porsche 911, and knew exactly how to flatter my parents into handing over their undivided attention and their endless praise. I heavily debated throwing the thick, gold-embossed invitation straight into the kitchen trash can. But I am a man who deeply respects duty and foundational family ties, even when those exact ties are actively strangling the life out of me. I put on my best tailored navy suit, polished my shoes until they looked like black glass, and drove out to the highly exclusive country club they had rented out for the evening. The massive venue smelled heavily of fresh white roses and expensive, imported lemon candles. Everyone in the room was smiling in that highly polished, completely artificial way people do when they know an expensive professional photographer is closely watching their every single move. I walked into the grand, echoing ballroom and easily found the main seating chart displayed on a massive, ornate golden easel near the entrance. I traced my finger down the list. There was the head table. Gideon, my mother Sylvia, Harrison, Valeria, and her wealthy, well-connected parents. Right next to Gideon's name was a beautiful, velvet-backed chair with a thick, expensive placeholder card. My name had been written on it originally. I could clearly see the deep indentations in the thick paper where the professional calligrapher had pressed down with a heavy fountain pen. But someone had taken a thick, black permanent marker and aggressively, violently crossed my name out. Right beneath the black ink, in rushed, sloppy handwriting, were the words vendor assistant. I stood there for a long time, the hired string quartet playing softly in the background, staring silently at the ultimate public insult. I looked across the massive, brightly lit room. At the very back, wedged terribly in the shadows by the loud, swinging kitchen doors, was a tiny round table squeezed next to a massive audio speaker. Sitting there were 3 bored, unengaged teenagers staring at their phones, the photographer's exhausted assistant who was busy sorting digital memory cards, and one single empty chair waiting for me. My brother Harrison caught my eye from directly across the room. He walked over, confidently adjusting his perfectly tailored, custom-fit tuxedo jacket. He did not look at the ruined, disrespectful card. He looked directly at my suit, checking to see if I fit the high-end aesthetic of his perfect day. He leaned in close and spoke in a low, incredibly tight warning voice. He told me not to make this evening about myself. He said I knew exactly how our mother gets when things look uneven, negative, or tense for the professional photographs. He treated my humiliation like an annoying administrative error that I just needed to quietly swallow. I did not argue with him. I simply picked up the ruined, humiliating place card, folded it carefully right down the middle, and slid it deep into my breast pocket. I walked the long, humiliating walk to the back of the room, sat down quietly next to the photographer's assistant, and watched my family celebrate a life they genuinely believed was vastly superior to mine. Sitting there in the cold shadows, heavy memories washed over me. This was absolutely not a new dynamic. For my entire adult life, my parents treated my rigorous career as a tedious, annoying joke. I am a compliance attorney. I read the massive, mind-numbing documents everyone else signs blindly. I find the buried penalty clauses, the hidden offshore shell companies, the entirely missing tax filings. I prevent massive, company-ending disasters before they ever make the morning news. But my family liked highly visible, easily bragged about success. My father liked ribbon cuttings, shiny brass plaques on walls, and men who wore large, ridiculously expensive watches that they used to assert dominance in a room. I clearly remembered a tense family dinner a few months before my brutal divorce. Valeria had just started seriously dating Harrison. She was completely dominating the dinner conversation, bragging loudly to my father about a massive commercial real estate acquisition her company, Bellstone Development, was putting together. My father was practically drooling over her ambition and her aggressive, cutthroat business tactics. I simply asked Valeria a standard, basic legal question about how she structured her investor disclosures to avoid long-term liability and regulatory fines. The entire dining room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Valeria looked at me like I had just asked her to scrub the kitchen floors on her hands and knees. She smiled a sweet, entirely fake smile and condescendingly said they had lower-level people for that kind of boring, tedious paperwork. Harrison laughed loudly and told the entire table that I read warning labels for fun and that I severely lacked the vision required for real wealth. My mother chimed in, saying it was a terrible shame I did not have Harrison's bold, fearless entrepreneurial spirit. I smiled politely and kept eating my steak, knowing exactly what kind of flashy, arrogant developers loudly dismiss compliance questions. The kind who aggressively build massive financial houses of cards that inevitably collapse. My dark, swirling reverie at the wedding reception was sharply broken when I went to the main bar to get a simple club soda with lime. The bartender had temporarily stepped away to change a heavy keg, and I found myself standing completely silently near a large, decorative floral pillar. On the exact other side, completely unaware of my quiet presence, were my mother Sylvia and my Aunt Fiona. Fiona was laughing softly into her crystal champagne glass. She explicitly asked my mother if she had seen my miserable, defeated face when I saw the back table near the kitchen. My mother sighed a long, dramatic, theatrical sigh. She said it was entirely necessary for the peace of the event. She told Fiona that my ugly, highly public divorce had brought a dark, heavy cloud of negativity over the Ward family name, and she simply could not risk me ruining Harrison's perfect aesthetic in the background of the main dinner photos. She openly, casually admitted she had specifically instructed Fiona to cross my name off the card and banish me to the back with the hired help. I gripped my glass until my knuckles turned stark white. My own mother. The absolute betrayal was not a loud, dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, suffocating poison dripping directly into my veins. I left the wedding reception before the expensive cake was even cut. I drove back to my quiet, empty apartment, taking the folded card out of my pocket and placing it flat on my wooden desk. I vowed right then and there, staring at the Chicago skyline, that I was entirely done being their emotional punching bag. But the universe has a very strange, twisted way of forcing you back into the ring just when you think you have finally walked away for good. Exactly 2 weeks after the agonizing wedding, my secure office phone rang loudly on my desk. It was Gideon. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a single word of apology for the horrific seating arrangement at the wedding. He aggressively ordered me to come to his main office at the logistics company immediately, speaking to me as if I were a junior intern who had messed up a coffee order. I drove across town, walked through the massive warehouse floor, and entered his massive corner office. It smelled exactly like cedar polish, old ambition, and the expensive cigars he saved for important clients. Gideon was sitting proudly behind his massive oak desk, beaming with a terrifying, entirely unearned level of pride. He proudly announced that Valeria was graciously allowing the family to get in on the very ground floor of a massive warehouse district acquisition just outside Milwaukee. He called it the lucrative, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would secure the family's legacy for generations. He boldly told me he was aggressively liquidating his most stable mutual funds, cashing out old inheritance bonds, and pulling heavily from the company's emergency payroll reserves to invest a staggering $2 million in cold, hard cash. I felt the blood completely drain from my face, pooling somewhere down in my expensive shoes. $2 million was a massive, irreplaceable chunk of his liquid net worth. It was the money meant for a secure retirement, the money meant to keep the logistics company afloat during bad economic quarters, the money that served as the foundational bedrock of our family's stability. I sat down very slowly in the leather guest chair opposite him. I did not yell. I kept my voice incredibly level and strictly professional. I formally asked to see the operating agreement, the fully audited financials, the clean title reports, and the Phase 1 environmental assessments for the property. Gideon slammed his heavy hand down hard on the solid oak desk, violently rattling his ceramic coffee mug. He told me I was doing it again. He said Valeria was family now, and treating her highly successful business like a hostile corporate takeover was deeply insulting to her, to Harrison, and to the trust of the family. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him straight to his face that due diligence absolutely does not care about wedding rings, family ties, or hurt feelings. I warned him that people who violently rush massive cash investments often rely heavily on the emotional fear of missing out to hide deep, catastrophic structural flaws in the legal paperwork. He waved his hand at me in absolute disgust, telling me to send an email to Valeria if I wanted to waste my own time. But the $2 million bank wire transfer was happening at the absolute end of the week regardless of what I said or what I found. I walked out of his office, drove straight back to my law firm, and immediately drafted a highly polite, legally airtight, formal email to Valeria requesting the standard, legally required disclosure packet for an investment of that magnitude. I CC'd my father to ensure there was a permanent, undeniable paper trail. 3 full, agonizing days passed. 0 response. Absolutely nothing. Instead, I received a highly aggressive, deeply unhinged phone call from Harrison. He completely bypassed saying hello and started shouting instantly into the receiver. He accused me of aggressively interrogating his new wife. He said I was deeply jealous of his sudden financial success and that I was actively trying to sabotage his fresh marriage out of pure, unadulterated bitterness over my own failed divorce. I told Harrison calmly that if the legal paperwork was clean, there was absolutely nothing to hide. He cursed at me, called me a miserable failure, and violently slammed the phone down. That exact night, I was sitting alone at my kitchen island, eating a cold sandwich in the dark, when my secure work phone vibrated aggressively on the granite counter. It was an urgent, highly flagged message from Rowan, my sharp, absolutely relentless legal assistant. He sent a secure, encrypted link to our firm's internal conflict check database system. I quickly opened my laptop and typed in my security credentials. Bellstone development had been heavily flagged in our internal corporate system exactly 8 months prior. One of our major, highly valued corporate clients had strongly considered leasing massive commercial office space from them and hired our firm to run a deep, comprehensive background check on Valeria's operation. The file Rowan uncovered was an absolute, unmitigated horror show of corporate liability. Bellstone had deeply inconsistent, highly suspicious ownership disclosures. One LLC legally listed Valeria as the sole managing member. Another deeply buried LLC listed her former college roommate. There were massive, completely unexplained cash transfers between corporate entities with zero clear business purpose, zero matching invoices, and zero tax justification. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, echoing in the quiet apartment. It was not conclusively criminal just yet, but it was a massive, glowing neon red flag for aggressive money laundering, severe asset mismanagement, or a classic Ponzi structure. I printed the entire massive file, stacking the warm papers neatly on my desk. I was not going to let my father lose his entire retirement fund and his life's work, even if he actively despised me. The very next morning, the situation escalated to a highly dangerous, critical level. I received an anonymous, fully encrypted email on my secure work server. The sender's IP address was completely masked through a VPN, but the attached file was a raw, unfiltered PDF of Bellstone's internal escrow accounting ledgers. I locked my office door, pulled the blinds, and spent 3 grueling, intense hours cross-referencing the internal numbers with the public tax filings. The puzzle pieces finally clicked firmly into place. The specific escrow account Valeria was explicitly telling private investors, like my father, to wire their money into did not match the actual, legally registered account listed on the binding property acquisition documents. The incoming investment money was being actively, deliberately diverted into an entirely separate shadow account. I later figured out the leak came directly from Desmond, Valeria's silent, highly secretive business partner. Desmond was a greedy, calculated snake who realized Valeria was getting incredibly sloppy with her corporate structuring. He wanted to use a relentless, obsessive compliance bulldog like me to completely blow up her side of the operation so he could easily sweep in and buy her out for absolute pennies on the dollar amidst a massive legal scandal. He was intentionally using me as a weapon, but I frankly didn't care about his underlying motives. The financial evidence in front of me was very real, fully documented, and incredibly damning. I picked up my office phone and called Gideon immediately. I told him, clearly, firmly, and without a shred of emotion, that he was walking completely blindfolded into a massive, highly illegal financial trap. I told him the escrow accounts absolutely did not match the legal corporate filings, and that Bellstone was officially flagged by my major law firm for highly suspicious, potentially fraudulent activity. The phone line was dead quiet for a very long, highly uncomfortable time. Then Gideon finally spoke. His voice was ice cold, dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. He told me I was a deeply broken, miserable, pathetic man who simply could not stand to see anyone else in the family achieve happiness or massive wealth. He explicitly, formally ordered me to never contact Harrison or Valeria again regarding their business affairs. He said I was entirely dead to him as a trusted son, and he would absolutely not let my toxic, deeply rooted jealousy ruin his legacy. The harsh, loud click of the phone hanging up echoed loudly in my quiet, empty office. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat completely still in the dark living room, drinking black, bitter coffee and watching the glowing city lights of Chicago flicker through the window blinds. I was running every possible legal scenario, every single regulatory loophole, and every courtroom defense through my highly trained head. At exactly 7:42 a.m. the next morning, my personal phone buzzed violently on the glass coffee table. It was an automated text message forwarded directly from Gideon. It was a clear, high-resolution screenshot of a bank wire transfer confirmation. $2 million officially and completely gone from his secure account. Under the photo was one single, brutal, devastating sentence typed by my father. Stop trying to run my life. I stared at the glowing screen for a very long time. The burning, heavy anger I had carried for months completely vanished in an instant. It was suddenly replaced by a deep, profound, terrifying calm. The exact kind of cold, absolute calm that only comes when you finally realize you have done absolutely everything within human power to save someone from a burning building, and they choose to lock the door from the inside. Now, the devastating financial and legal consequences belonged entirely to them. I showered in scalding hot water, put on my sharpest, most intimidating charcoal suit, adjusted my tie, and drove aggressively through the heavy morning traffic to my corporate firm. At exactly 9 a.m., our firm was scheduled to thoroughly review a massive distressed property package for a major, highly influential institutional banking client. The seller of this massive distressed package? Bellstone Development, Valeria's company. When I confidently walked into the main corporate bullpen, carrying my heavy briefcase, Tristan, a slimy, highly ambitious rival attorney in my division who absolutely loved stepping on people's necks to get a quick promotion, physically intercepted me in the hallway. Tristan knew all about the highly sensitive Bellstone file. He smirked an arrogant, highly punchable smirk and told me I was officially taken off the meeting. He arrogantly stated he had spoken to the managing partner early this morning and told her I had a severe, highly unethical conflict of interest because Bellstone was run by my new sister-in-law. Tristan desperately wanted all the massive billable hours and the immense corporate glory of closing the multimillion-dollar banking deal entirely by himself. I did not flinch. I did not argue with him in the public hallway. I simply stared right through him, walked straight past his smug face, and knocked firmly on the heavy, frosted glass door of Cassandra's massive corner office. Cassandra was our formidable managing partner. She was a brilliant, ruthless woman who absolutely did not care about hurt feelings, family drama, or petty, childish office politics. She only cared about strict corporate risk mitigation, flawless billable accuracy, and fiercely protecting the firm from massive liability lawsuits. I walked in without waiting for an invitation and placed a thick, perfectly organized, highly indexed binder heavily on her polished mahogany desk. I looked her dead in the eye, maintaining absolute professional composure, and told her I had properly, legally disclosed the family connection to the corporate HR department exactly 3 weeks ago in writing. I told her I was absolutely not representing Bellstone in any capacity. I was relentlessly, brutally auditing them to protect our highly valued banking client from a massive disaster. Then, I tapped the thick binder with my index finger. I told her Bellstone was currently actively diverting private investor funds through a highly illegal, entirely unregistered shadow escrow account, and that if our banking client signed that acquisition today, our firm would be directly tied to facilitating federal wire fraud on a massive scale. Cassandra slowly opened the heavy binder. She read the first page in total, unbroken silence. Then the second. Her sharp, calculating expression never changed, but the air in the room grew incredibly heavy and dangerously tense. She slowly closed the binder, looked up at me with piercing, cold eyes, and asked a simple, incredibly direct question. She asked if I could conclusively, legally prove this massive fraud in the room today in front of the highly impatient buyers. I told her I had the entire, undeniable paper trail locked down to the exact minute of the offshore transfers. Cassandra stood up, smoothing her tailored skirt. She looked through the glass wall at Tristan, who was hovering nervously outside like a desperate vulture waiting for corporate scraps. She pointed a manicured finger directly at me. Julian leads the risk assessment today. Get in the room and completely dismantle them. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward conference room 14. I could clearly hear the low, arrogant murmur of highly confident voices coming from inside. Valeria, Harrison, and their expensive, flashy outside lawyers were in there, casually drinking our expensive corporate coffee, genuinely believing they were completely untouchable. They thought they had just easily, effortlessly secured $2 million of my foolish father's money, and now they were about to quickly secure a massive multimillion-dollar buyout from our corporate banking client. They thought they had entirely won the game. They thought the quiet, boring compliance attorney they had maliciously banished to the children's table at the wedding was completely powerless to stop them. I reached out, gripped the cold brass handle, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The entire room went completely dead silent. Valeria looked up from her phone, her highly arrogant smile freezing instantly on her face. Harrison froze completely still, an expensive porcelain coffee cup hovering exactly halfway to his open mouth. The look of sheer, unadulterated panic and absolute shock that rapidly washed over my golden child brother's face was a masterpiece I will clearly remember for the rest of my natural life. I calmly walked directly to the head of the long mahogany table, set my heavy binder down with a loud, echoing thud, and slowly unbuttoned my suit jacket. "Good morning," I said, my voice incredibly steady, completely professional, and ice cold. "Let's talk about the missing money." The heavy oak door of conference room 14 closed firmly behind me, and the loud, echoing click of the brass latch sounded exactly like a prison cell locking shut. I stood at the head of the massive, polished mahogany table. The room was absolutely pristine, heavily air-conditioned, smelling strongly of expensive leather chairs, fresh corporate coffee, and high-stakes arrogance. I did not sit down. I slowly unbuttoned my suit jacket, pulled out the heavy chair at the head of the table, and placed my hands flat on the cool wood. Valeria was sitting near the direct center of the long table, flanked on both sides by two highly expensive, sharply dressed outside lawyers. Her custom designer blazer was perfectly pressed, a stark white contrast to the dark room, and her massive diamond engagement ring caught the harsh fluorescent light overhead every time she moved her hand. When she first saw me walk through those doors, her initial shock quickly morphed into a tight, incredibly condescending smile. She genuinely believed I was a lost puppy who had wandered into the wrong high-rise office building. She thought I was just the bitter, newly divorced older brother who read boring compliance manuals for a meager salary, completely out of my depth in a room full of real financial players. Her brand new Porsche 911 keys were sitting casually on the table next to her legal pad, a silent, obnoxious brag to the room about her supposed wealth. Harrison was sitting right next to her, and his reaction was entirely different. He had a pristine white porcelain coffee cup hovering exactly halfway to his open mouth. He lowered the cup very slowly, his hand visibly shaking so hard it caused the dark liquid to ripple and spill slightly onto the pristine glass coaster. He looked incredibly out of place among the hardcore corporate attorneys and seasoned investment bankers in the room. He was a man who played a highly successful entrepreneur on social media, posting inspirational quotes and photos of expensive dinners, but in a room full of actual financial predators, he looked entirely exposed. His tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. To my immediate left sat the three senior representatives from the massive institutional bank we were representing. They were older men, entirely devoid of humor or patience, wearing conservative gray suits and holding heavy silver pens. They were here to formally sign off on a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate acquisition. They fully expected a smooth, easy, highly profitable transaction so they could go back to their country clubs by 3 in the afternoon. They looked at me with mild annoyance, waiting for the meeting to formally commence. Valeria leaned back aggressively in her plush leather chair and crossed her arms over her chest. Her voice was dripping with fake sweetness and pure, unadulterated poison. She asked me, loud enough for the entire room to hear, what exactly I thought I was doing crashing a closed-door corporate acquisition meeting. She looked directly at the senior bankers and casually joked that I was just her husband's older brother, an entry-level attorney who clearly had a severe misunderstanding of office geography and corporate hierarchy. She was actively trying to publicly humiliate me again, using the exact same bullying tactic she had successfully used at our tense family dinner table and at her lavish, over-the-top wedding. She expected me to shrink, apologize, and awkwardly shuffle out the door. I did not smile. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I looked directly past her completely, refusing to give her the validation of my attention, and made absolute dead-eye contact with her lead outside counsel. I formally introduced myself to the room. I stated my full name, and I announced my title as the lead senior risk mitigation officer for the firm, acting directly under the unilateral authority of our managing partner, Cassandra. I stated clearly, projecting my voice toward the official audio recording device in the center of the table, that I was here to present the final, binding compliance audit regarding Bellstone Development's pending commercial real estate package. Valeria's fake, arrogant smile completely vanished from her face. It was entirely erased. The corporate lawyers sitting next to her immediately sat up completely straight, their posture shifting from relaxed to highly defensive. They knew exactly what the title of Senior Risk Mitigation Officer meant in a firm of this immense size. It meant I was not a junior associate fetching coffee. It meant I had the unilateral, absolute legal power to kill the entire multimillion-dollar deal with one single stroke of my pen on the final risk assessment form. I opened the thick, heavily indexed binder I had placed on the table. The sharp sound of the heavy paper turning was the only noise in the dead-silent room. I looked directly at the lead investment banker, a man named Sterling who had a reputation for being completely ruthless with bad investments. I told him that before his bank authorized the transfer of the massive purchase funds to Bellstone Development, we needed to urgently discuss a severe, highly irregular series of discrepancies in the seller's internal escrow ledgers and their corporate tax filings. One of Valeria's lawyers immediately objected, attempting to regain control of the room. He leaned forward aggressively, his face flushing a deep angry red, and stated loudly that all financial disclosures had been heavily vetted, independently audited, and legally certified by their own team 3 weeks ago. He aggressively accused me of highly unprofessional conduct, citing a supposed conflict of interest, and directly threatened to file a formal, career-ending complaint against me with the State Bar Association. He demanded I leave the room immediately so the adults could finish their high-level business. I ignored him completely. A compliance attorney does not argue with a barking dog. A compliance attorney simply shows the dog its leash. I pulled out a heavy stack of high-resolution printed documents and smoothly slid them across the long mahogany table toward the bankers. I told the room to turn specifically to page 42 of the main compliance packet. I kept my voice incredibly flat, completely devoid of any personal emotion or family resentment. I told them they were looking directly at the official, legally binding operating agreement for the exact commercial property they were attempting to purchase today. I pointed a pen at the document, highlighting the specific bank routing number and the exact legal entity name listed for the required corporate escrow account. I asked them to verify the numbers out loud. Sterling read the numbers. They matched the contract perfectly. Then, I reached back into my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a second stack of documents. These were the highly confidential, raw internal accounting ledgers that Desmond, Valeria's treacherous, backstabbing business partner, had secretly leaked to me on my fully encrypted corporate server late last night. I slid these unauthorized copies across the table as well, placing them directly next to the official contract. I told the senior bankers to look very closely at the second set of numbers. I stated clearly, making sure the recording device caught every single syllable, that the specific bank account Valeria had been actively using to collect private investor capital over the last 90 days absolutely did not match the legally binding account officially registered with the State Real Estate Commission. I told them the private investor funds were being aggressively, deliberately diverted into a completely unregistered, highly hidden shadow account operating under an entirely different corporate LLC, one that had zero legal ties to the property being sold today. Sterling picked up his silver reading glasses, put them on with agonizing slowness, and stared intently at the documents. He cross-referenced the routing numbers. The silence in the room was so thick and heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on our chests. He looked up at Valeria. His eyes were completely cold, entirely devoid of any professional courtesy. He asked her, in a very quiet, very dangerous voice, to immediately explain the blatant, highly illegal discrepancy in her corporate accounting. Valeria swallowed hard. I could physically see the muscles in her throat working. For the very first time since I had met her at that family dinner months ago, the arrogant, completely untouchable real estate developer looked genuinely terrified. The polished facade was cracking wide open. She desperately adjusted the cuffs of her expensive designer blazer, trying to buy herself 3 seconds of time. She stammered slightly, a massive departure from her usual smooth talking. She claimed it was simply a minor, unfortunate administrative clerical error. She actually tried to laugh it off, a nervous, high-pitched sound that echoed terribly in the quiet room. She said her entire accounting department had recently undergone a messy, complicated software migration, and that some of the routing numbers had simply been accidentally swapped in the automated system. She looked desperately at Harrison for emotional support, but my brother was staring down at the damning documents, his face completely pale, his breathing becoming incredibly shallow and rapid. He looked like he was about to pass out. I did not let her breathe. I did not give her a single inch of room to maneuver or spin her web of lies. I leaned over the table, pressing my weight into my hands. I told the room that a clerical error is when you misspell a street address on a mailing envelope. A clerical error is not when you deliberately create a secondary, fully unregistered limited liability company, mask the true corporate ownership behind a former college roommate who lives in another state, and actively funnel millions of dollars of undocumented cash through offshore holding accounts to avoid federal tax liability. Her lead lawyer held up his hand forcefully, aggressively signaling me to stop speaking. He stated firmly that these were incredibly serious, highly defamatory allegations based entirely on unverified, potentially stolen internal documents. He said they would absolutely not sit here and be subjected to a hostile, illegal interrogation. He aggressively threatened to slap me, my managing partner, and my entire firm with a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit for tortious interference with a business contract. I looked him dead in the eyes. I did not blink. I told him he was absolutely welcome to file whatever frivolous lawsuit he wanted, but he needed to take a very hard look at the documents in front of him and realize his own client had lied directly to his face for months. I told the highly paid lawyer that if he continued to blindly defend this fraudulent transaction with his signature, he would be actively, legally implicating himself in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy, and his law license would be shredded by the ethics committee before the end of the fiscal year. The lawyer's aggressive, intimidating posture instantly completely collapsed. Corporate attorneys are incredibly brave when they are actively protecting their massive billable hours, but they are absolute, undeniable cowards the exact second their own law licenses and personal freedom are directly threatened by a federal indictment. He slowly leaned back in his plush chair, physically distancing himself from Valeria. He dropped his pen on the table. It was the ultimate unspoken sign of a sinking ship. He was officially abandoning her. I turned my absolute attention back to Valeria. I leaned slightly closer to her across the table. I asked her a very simple, incredibly direct question. I asked her exactly what happened to the massive $2 million wire transfer that officially originated from Gideon Ward's logistics company at exactly 7:42 a.m. this very morning. Harrison gasped audibly. It was a loud, wet sound. His head snapped up violently, and he stared at his new wife with wide, completely horrified eyes. He asked her, his voice trembling, what I was talking about. He asked her if she had actually taken our father's entire retirement money, the money meant to keep the family safe. Valeria's carefully constructed, highly manicured mask completely shattered into a million pieces. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated, venomous hatred. She hissed through her perfectly white, expensive teeth that Gideon was family, and that his private, personal investment in her growing company had absolutely nothing to do with the corporate real estate transaction on the table today. She aggressively demanded I stay entirely out of her personal family business. I stood up completely straight, buttoning my suit jacket. I looked around the room, making absolutely sure every single senior banker and corporate attorney was paying absolute, unbroken attention to my next words. I told Valeria that the exact second she illegally commingled my father's private $2 million investment with the fraudulent, unregistered shadow account tied directly to this corporate acquisition, she made it my absolute business to destroy her. The legal trap was fully set. The massive steel doors had closed tight, and she was entirely boxed in with no escape route. But the real, absolute devastation, the ultimate plot twist that would completely destroy her entire criminal empire and shatter my brother's fake reality forever, was still sitting quietly in the thick, unmarked manila folder directly under my left hand. I was about to show the entire room exactly where that missing $2 million was actually going. The tension inside conference room 14 was absolutely suffocating, heavy enough to crush bone. The lead investment banker, Sterling, took off his silver reading glasses and placed them deliberately, almost aggressively, on the polished mahogany table. He looked directly at me, his face a complete mask of pure, unforgiving corporate ruthlessness. He did not care about family drama. He cared about massive federal fines. He asked me the only legal question that actually mattered in that exact moment. He asked me exactly where the diverted, unregistered money was currently sitting. He needed to know, for his own legal protection, if his banking institution was about to blindly underwrite a massive, highly illegal criminal enterprise. I slowly opened the final, thick manila folder. I did not rush the process. I let the agonizing, terrifying silence stretch out, letting Valeria physically sweat through her highly expensive silk blouse. I reached in and pulled out a heavily highlighted, incredibly detailed financial flowchart that Rowan, my brilliant legal assistant, and I had stayed up until 3 in the morning building. It was a flawless, undeniable forensic trace of the shadow escrow account, mapping every single digital dollar that entered and exited the fraudulent LLC. I handed the massive chart directly to Sterling, intentionally bypassing Valeria completely as if she did not even exist. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of triumph, delivering the absolute killing blow with the cold, calculated precision of a trauma surgeon. I explained to the room that the staggering $2 million my father, Gideon, had blindly and foolishly wired at exactly 7:42 a.m. did not sit in Valeria's shadow account for more than 12 total minutes. I told the bankers that at exactly 7:54 a.m., the entire massive sum was aggressively, digitally transferred out of Bellstone Development's legal control entirely. It was wired in one single lump sum directly to a highly obscure, secondary holding company officially registered in the state of Delaware. Valeria lunged forward in her chair, violently slamming both her hands flat on the heavy wooden table. She completely lost all remaining shreds of her polished corporate composure. She screamed at me at the top of her lungs to shut my mouth. She desperately demanded her silent lawyers immediately issue a legally binding gag order to stop me from speaking. She was actively hyperventilating, her chest heaving, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to run. Her eyes were completely wild and frantic, like a trapped animal staring at a hunter. But her highly paid outside counsel simply sat there, staring blankly down at their yellow legal pads, completely refusing to speak or intervene. They had officially, legally abandoned her to the wolves. I did not stop talking. I simply raised my voice just enough to cut cleanly and sharply right through her hysterical, desperate shouting. I told the room of bankers to look very closely at the legally registered owner of that specific Delaware holding company receiving the stolen funds. I turned my head and looked directly at Harrison. My golden child brother was practically shrinking into his expensive, plush leather chair, his face entirely devoid of color, looking physically ill. I ordered Harrison to read the name of the managing director of the holding company out loud to the room. I slid a copy of the document directly in front of him. He stared down at the highlighted paper. His lips moved, trembling violently, but no sound came out of his mouth. He looked up at me, his eyes completely filled with a complex mixture of absolute, undeniable horror and complete, soul-crushing betrayal. The name legally printed on the document was Brenda, my completely unhinged, deeply malicious former mother-in-law, the exact same woman who had stood aggressively on my front porch, screaming that I was a failure and threatening to ruin my reputation at the HOA meeting. The exact same vile woman my own father had fiercely and publicly defended on speakerphone while he actively disowned me for trying to protect his business. The entire conference room went completely, utterly still. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. It took several long, agonizing seconds for the absolute, staggering magnitude of the plot twist to fully register with everyone in the room. I stood there and laid the entire, ugly, devastating truth bare for everyone to see. I explained, methodically and clearly, that Valeria and Brenda were absolutely not strangers who happened to cross paths. They had been secretly, aggressively colluding for over 2.5 years. When my ex-wife's greedy family was actively draining my father's logistics company through a sophisticated web of phantom vendors and heavily padded expense reports, the stolen money was not being spent on luxury goods. It was quietly, systematically being funneled directly to fund Valeria's rapidly failing real estate projects. Bellstone Development was not a wildly successful boutique firm. It was essentially a massive, highly leveraged Ponzi scheme, propped up entirely by the stolen cash from my father's own business. When I finally uncovered the theft, forced the brutal divorce, and aggressively demanded the fraudulent staff be fired from the logistics company, I completely severed their primary illicit cash flow. Valeria's company was suddenly, violently starved for capital. They were facing imminent, crushing bankruptcy and massive federal audits. So, they hatched a desperate, incredibly brazen, highly calculated plan. Valeria specifically targeted Harrison. She aggressively manipulated my deeply foolish, wildly status-obsessed brother, dazzling my deeply insecure, image-conscious parents with a flashy Porsche 911, expensive country club dinners, and completely fake promises of immense generational wealth. They successfully, brilliantly convinced my stubborn father to voluntarily hand over $2 million of his own hard-earned retirement money under the convincing guise of a highly lucrative commercial real estate investment. But the money was never, ever meant for real estate. It was immediately routed directly to Brenda's offshore holding company to aggressively pay off the massive, crippling financial debts Valeria owed her for the previous years of corporate money laundering and failed projects. My father had literally, willingly just paid his own robbers to continue robbing him in broad daylight. Harrison let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal, a deep, guttural sob of absolute devastation. He turned very slowly to his new wife. He asked her, his voice cracking and utterly broken, if a single word of it was true. He asked her if their entire whirlwind romance, the lavish, incredibly expensive country club wedding where they banished me to the back, the endless promises of building a massive corporate empire together, was just a sophisticated, highly calculated corporate heist designed to steal our family's money. Valeria did not look at him. She could not meet his eyes. She stared straight ahead at the blank mahogany wall, her jaw locked completely tight, her breathing shallow and fast. She had absolutely nothing to say. There was no clever spin, no lie that could save her. The forensic paper trail was absolutely flawless, completely undeniable, and entirely devastating to her future. Sterling, the lead investment banker, stood up abruptly, the heavy legs of his chair scraping loudly against the carpet. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket with sharp, angry, incredibly precise movements. He looked down at Valeria with a level of absolute disgust normally reserved for toxic waste. He stated loudly, ensuring it was captured for the official firm record, that his banking institution was immediately and permanently withdrawing completely from the proposed acquisition. He aggressively announced that he was legally, ethically obligated to instantly flag the entire Bellstone corporate account for severe suspicious activity with the federal regulatory authorities. He turned directly to me, nodded once in deep, professional respect for the trap I had built, and walked straight out of the heavy oak doors with his entire team following closely behind him. Valeria's outside lawyers immediately packed their expensive leather briefcases in absolute, frantic, panicked silence. They practically sprinted out of the room, desperate to rapidly distance themselves from the highly radioactive fallout of a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy that was about to make national news. Within exactly 4 minutes, the bustling, high-stakes corporate meeting was entirely over. The multi-million-dollar banking deal was completely, permanently dead. The financial lifeline Valeria needed to stay out of prison was permanently severed. Only Valeria, Harrison, and I remained sitting in the massive, quiet room. I slowly, meticulously packed my heavily indexed compliance binders back into my heavy leather briefcase. I snapped the solid brass locks shut. The sharp, clicking sound echoed loudly in the empty room. I looked at Valeria one last time, feeling absolutely nothing for her. I told her in a completely flat voice that she should probably call a very good, very expensive criminal defense attorney immediately, because my firm was officially forwarding the entire forensic financial audit directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission before lunch. I turned my back on them and walked out of conference room 14, leaving my completely broken brother and his highly fraudulent wife sitting utterly alone in the absolute, smoking ruins of their carefully constructed lies. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The high-speed elevator ride down to the main lobby was incredibly quiet, giving me a moment to breathe. I stepped out onto the bustling downtown Chicago street. The freezing cold wind hit my face hard, but for the very first time in nearly 2 years, I did not feel the freezing chill in my bones. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute, undeniable vindication. I had not screamed. I had not thrown a tantrum. I had used cold, hard, unfeeling legal paper to completely obliterate the very people who had treated me like garbage. But the real, deeply personal emotional fallout was just about to begin. Because while Valeria was facing hard time in federal prison, my father was about to wake up and realize he had voluntarily burned his entire life's work to the ground just to protect his own arrogant pride. The immediate, sweeping aftermath of the explosive boardroom confrontation was entirely ugly, but it happened in a very quiet, incredibly expensive, highly legal way. The complete collapse of Bellstone Development was not a loud, cinematic explosion. It was a rapid, brutal, completely unforgiving financial implosion that violently sucked everyone involved down into the absolute dark. By the end of the business week, the federal regulators at the SEC had officially and aggressively frozen every single corporate and personal bank account tied to Valeria, Brenda, and their endless, complicated web of shady LLCs. The staggering $2 million wire transfer my father had so arrogantly and foolishly sent was completely locked down in a massive, complicated federal asset seizure. Because the money had been rapidly, illegally commingled with highly illicit funds inside Brenda's offshore holding company, the government treated every single penny as active, radioactive evidence of a massive money laundering operation. Gideon could not touch a single cent of his own retirement. His entire financial safety net vanished into a government vault. Valeria's flashy, arrogant, highly curated facade completely evaporated overnight. People who actively build their entire existence on a fake, highly polished image are quickly surrounded by greedy opportunists who immediately vanish the exact second the stolen money stops flowing. Desmond, her treacherous, backstabbing business partner who had leaked the damning documents to me, loudly and publicly resigned. He held a press conference aggressively blaming Valeria for severe corporate mismanagement and poor financial controls, desperately trying to play the innocent victim who was duped by a rogue partner. The feds didn't buy a word of it. They eventually indicted him too, dragging him out of his office in handcuffs. The brand new, aggressively loud Porsche 911 that Valeria used to blindly dazzle my naive parents was violently repossessed by the bank from their upscale driveway in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, right in front of the entire neighborhood. Harrison had to stand on his perfectly manicured lawn, humiliated, and watch the heavy tow truck drag away his entire fake identity while the neighbors peeked through their blinds. Exactly 12 days after the devastating corporate meeting, my apartment intercom buzzed violently at 9 o'clock at night. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing a standard employment contract, completely at peace. I walked over and looked at the grainy black and white security monitor. It was Gideon. I pressed the heavy button to let him up, bracing myself for a fight. When I opened my heavy front door, I barely recognized the man standing in my brightly lit hallway. Gideon had always been a man who aggressively projected immense strength, absolute certainty, and highly toxic pride. Now, he simply looked incredibly old and deeply broken. His expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled. His silk tie was completely loosened, and his face had the gray, hollow, deeply stunned look of a man whose massive, fragile ego had finally handed him a devastating financial bill he absolutely could not afford to pay. He asked quietly, his voice lacking its usual booming authority, if he could come inside. I stepped aside, leaving plenty of space between us, and let him into my living room. He stood near my sofa, awkwardly looking around at my apartment as though he was seeing my actual life for the very first time. He noticed the neat bookshelves filled with heavy legal volumes, the highly organized desk, the framed certificate from the State Bar Association proudly displayed on the wall. He was observing the quiet, undeniable evidence that I had successfully built a whole, highly functional, completely stable existence completely without needing him, his money, or his toxic approval. He held a crumpled, tear-stained piece of official paper in his trembling right hand. It was a formal printed notice from the Federal Asset Forfeiture Division regarding his seized $2 million. He looked at me, his eyes entirely bloodshot and ringed with deep, dark bags. He asked me, his voice cracking, barely above a whisper, if the money was completely gone forever. I looked at him. I deeply expected to feel a massive surge of triumph. I expected to feel the burning satisfaction of rubbing his monumental failure in his face. But I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I just felt incredibly, profoundly tired. I told him, in my standard compliance attorney voice, that the funds were indefinitely frozen pending a massive, multi-year federal criminal investigation. I explicitly, formally told him he needed to immediately hire highly aggressive, independent corporate defense counsel, completely separate from anyone tied to Harrison or Valeria, just to desperately keep himself out of federal prison for accidental conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He nodded very slowly, absorbing the absolute horror of his situation. He sank down heavily onto the edge of my sofa like his knees had entirely given out under the crushing weight of reality. For a very long moment, neither of us spoke a single word. The silence in the apartment was completely deafening, filled only by the distant sounds of Chicago traffic below. Then, he looked down at his expensive leather shoes and said the exact 5 words I had waited years to hear. I should have listened to you. It would be incredibly easy for me to sit here, looking at the camera, and tell you that one simple, tearful sentence magically healed years of severe emotional abuse and neglect. It absolutely did not. Some deep, jagged wounds do not instantly close just because the person holding the knife finally turns on the light and sees the blood on their own hands. I walked over to my heavy oak desk, picked up a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder I had prepared days ago, and handed it directly to him. I told him this was exactly what he needed to send to his new, expensive defense attorney to save his own skin. It contained every single warning email I had sent him, every deliberately unanswered document request, the massive public record searches I had run, and the highly aggressive, unhinged voicemail Harrison had left me accusing me of jealousy. Gideon looked down at the thick folder resting in his hands. He looked up at me, his eyes finally brimming with unshed tears of deep regret. He asked me, his voice thick with emotion, if I had all of this meticulously ready because I knew he was inevitably going to come crawling and begging for my help. I looked him dead in the eye, completely unmoving. I said no. I told him I had it ready because rigorously doing the required work and aggressively uncovering the hard truth is exactly what I do for a living. I told him it was the exact same career he had openly mocked, belittled, and dismissed for my entire adult life. He swallowed hard. He did not try to defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He looked at the floor again, shrinking into himself. He whispered, barely audible, that he had let them put me at that humiliating, isolating back table near the kitchen doors at the wedding. He admitted, finally, that he saw the aggressively crossed-out place card with his own eyes before he sat down to eat his expensive steak. That admission hurt far more than I ever expected it to. Until that exact moment, a small, foolish, desperate part of my inner child had deeply wanted to believe that maybe he simply hadn't noticed the cruelty. Maybe he was just distracted. I looked at him and asked, very quietly, with years of pain behind the question, why he didn't say a single thing to defend his own son. Gideon looked like a completely broken, defeated man. He said my mother, Sylvia, had told him that my ugly divorce was bringing a bad, depressing aesthetic to the highly anticipated family photos. He said she confidently assured him that I was strong enough to quietly handle the blatant disrespect. He said the family motto had always been that Julian will adjust. Julian will fix it. Julian will quietly absorb all the awkward, painful, ugly parts of reality so everyone else in the family can stay beautiful, happy, and completely perfect in the picture. I stood completely still in my living room. I looked down at my father, the man who had traded his son for a good photo op, and I finally established the absolute, unbreakable boundary that would clearly define the rest of my life. I told him that I did understand my place at the table. I told him that was exactly the problem. I asked him to leave my apartment and not come back without calling. He slowly stood up, clutching the heavy legal folder to his chest like a bulletproof shield, and walked out the door into the hallway. The massive, impressive logistics empire he had built over decades was crumbling into ash. His golden child's marriage was a highly active federal crime scene, and the only capable son who had tried to actively save him from ruin was finally locking the door. 6 long, quiet months slowly passed. The change in my life and my family dynamic was not instantaneous or incredibly dramatic. Real, lasting emotional healing is rarely that tidy, clean, or cinematic. It is entirely a slow, deliberate, incredibly quiet process of simply refusing to participate in the chaos anymore. Harrison officially filed for a highly publicized legal annulment from Valeria exactly 8 weeks after the explosive corporate meeting that ended her career. The legal grounds for the separation were incredibly complicated, involving massive, undeniable financial fraud, hidden offshore liabilities, and deceit. But the core emotional truth of the breakup was incredibly simple and entirely devastating for him. My brother had eagerly, blindly married a highly curated, entirely fake, Instagram-filtered version of a woman that absolutely could not survive a single hour of rigorous, competent legal paperwork. He and I absolutely did not become close overnight. We didn't suddenly start grabbing beers on weekends to watch the game, or pretending the past decade of his endless arrogance and entitlement hadn't happened. But one cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon, Harrison unexpectedly showed up unannounced at my law firm's reception area. He waited quietly on the leather couch. He looked noticeably thinner, his face drawn, significantly older, and entirely stripped of his previous obnoxious, wealthy swagger. He was wearing a plain, off-the-rack jacket, absolutely no expensive watch on his wrist, and the heavy, crushing weight of reality had permanently altered his posture. He looked like a normal, humbled guy. We sat at a small, wobbly table in the corner of a nearby, inexpensive coffee shop. He stared deeply into his black coffee for a very long time, nervously tracing the rim of the paper cup. Then, he delivered a massive, unexpected twist that finally, completely closed the chapter on the entire family nightmare. Harrison quietly, painfully confessed that he had actually found one of Valeria's hidden, unencrypted escrow ledgers on her laptop 3 full days before the lavish country club wedding. He admitted, his voice shaking, that he saw the incredibly weird, highly suspicious massive cash transfers to Brenda's holding company. He knew, deep down in his gut, that something was horribly, legally wrong. I stared at him, my coffee completely turning cold in my hands. I felt a surge of absolute disbelief. I asked him, my voice tight, why he didn't stop the wedding. I asked him why he willingly, knowingly let our father wire $2 million of his retirement fund into a blazing financial fire. Harrison looked up, his eyes completely filled with a deep, entirely pathetic, sickening shame. He admitted that he was absolutely terrified of the massive public embarrassment of suddenly canceling a high-profile country club wedding. He confessed that he was deeply, hopelessly addicted to the lavish, wealthy lifestyle Valeria effortlessly provided. The expensive, comped dinners, the elite country club status, the keys to the brand-new Porsche 911 that made him look so successful. He said he actively chose to turn a blind eye, desperately lying to himself, hoping it was just a minor, clever tax loophole, because he wanted to desperately keep playing the role of the highly successful, self-made wealthy entrepreneur. He had literally sold our father out, risking his dad's entire life savings, just to keep up fake appearances on his social media accounts. He looked at me, tears welling in his eyes, and asked if I hated him. I leaned back heavily in my chair, listening to the rain hit the coffee shop window. The old version of Julian would have yelled. The old version would have aggressively, relentlessly lectured him on basic morality, fiduciary duty, and severe legal liability. But this new version of myself just felt a profound, incredibly heavy pity for a man who desperately needed an audience so badly, he would completely destroy his own blood just to keep them clapping. I told Harrison very calmly that I didn't hate him. I told him I was just completely, permanently done rescuing him from the severe, highly predictable consequences of his own terrible choices. I paid for the coffees, stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked back to my office in the rain. That was the most honest, brutal, completely unvarnished conversation I had ever had with my brother, and it finally truly set me completely free from his shadow. My father changed too, but the process was painfully slow and heavily bruised by massive financial reality. He managed to recover a very small, pathetic fraction of his initial wire transfer years later after the feds finally dismantled the complex shell companies, but he permanently lost the vast majority of his retirement cushion. His lifestyle had to severely downsize. He never once complained about the massive financial loss in front of me. He started emailing me commercial vendor contracts before signing them. At first, his emails were incredibly stiff, awkward, and formal. Then, they slowly became shorter and slightly more human. One random Sunday, he called me just to ask if I could briefly walk him through a complicated liability clause in a new warehouse lease. There was absolutely no performance, no arrogant pride, no demanding tone. It was just an aging father respectfully asking his highly competent son for professional help. I helped him, not because he suddenly deserved unlimited, unconditional access to my time, but because I had finally learned how to offer my specific skills without completely disappearing into the toxic role of the unpaid family servant. My mother, Sylvia, remained the absolute hardest element to navigate. She loved her two sons, but she loved social appearances, country club gossip, and community status with a terrifying devotion that bordered on religious fanaticism. She tried repeatedly, desperately to organize massive, sweeping family dinners to instantly reset the tone and sweep the entire devastating criminal scandal neatly under the rug as if it were a minor misunderstanding. I politely but incredibly firmly declined every single invitation. She eventually sent me a long, highly edited text apologizing for any hurt feelings around the wedding seating arrangement. It was absolutely not a real apology. It was a carefully crafted PR statement designed to absolve her of guilt. I did not fight her on it. I simply stopped pretending that vague, empty, meaningless words could ever repair specific, highly intentional harm. I went extremely low contact, firmly placing a heavy, permanent lock on a door I used to leave wide open for them to constantly walk all over. When people at my firm asked me if completely exposing Valeria and brutally dismantling my brother's fake life felt incredibly satisfying, I never exactly know how to answer them. I did not walk into that high-stakes corporate conference room carrying years of heavy family resentment, actively looking for a cinematic stage for revenge. I walked in perfectly prepared because rigorous preparation, absolute compliance, and finding the unvarnished truth is exactly what my job requires. The undeniable facts, the bank routing numbers, and the heavy paper trail did the rest of the heavy lifting for me. That is exactly what my family completely failed to understand about me for 34 long years. My quiet calm was never a sign of submission or weakness. My basic compliance questions at dinner were never born out of toxic jealousy. My deep caution was not bitterness over my divorce. My absolute silence at that back table by the kitchen was not agreement with my own humiliation. I was never trying to ruin anyone's perfect life. I simply decided to stop aggressively protecting their beautiful, fragile lives from the crushing, undeniable weight of their own legal paper trail. Today, my life is incredibly quiet, deeply peaceful, and entirely my own to control. I still live in the exact same apartment in Chicago. I still make hot mint tea at night while looking out at the glowing city lights. I still read massive corporate contracts line by agonizing line, and I still loudly, confidently notice when the numbers absolutely do not match. But I no longer shrink my own massive confidence or lower my undeniable worth just to make careless, arrogant people feel comfortable in their delusions. Just last week, I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. I pulled out the folded, heavy cream place card that I had carried out of the wedding. The one with my name violently crossed out with black marker and vendor assistant scrawled underneath. I also had the pristine, completely unused card that Harrison had returned to me during his coffee shop confession. I didn't burn them in a dramatic fit of rage. I didn't rip them up into tiny pieces. I simply placed both of them into a plain white envelope, sealed it tight, and wrote 2 words across the front in thick black ink: "Enough now." Because I know exactly who I am, and I don't need their validation anymore. I am the man who sat quietly at the back table and said absolutely nothing. I am the man who quietly kept the receipts. I am the man who diligently read the documents everyone else ignored. And when the entire room finally asked the right question, I was the one holding the absolute truth. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, uncompromising line to protect yourself from the exact people who should have protected you? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.